Hello there and welcome back to the next part of my T-34 85 build. In the last part I constructed the kit, added additional textures and made some storage items using Milliput. In this episode I will finish the model by painting it and doing an all-around weathering. I hope you stick around until the end, and without further ado, let's begin with the priming. I will start with a layer of Vallejo Mecha Primer Black. This will unify the surface since I used different materials. I used some liquid masking on the clear viewports to keep them clean from any paint. After everything is primed, I let the paint completely dry for around 24 hours. I always like the look of a completely black tank. They remind me of those special Black Edition ships from World of Warships. For the color scheme I went with the typical Soviet green. For the base layer I used AK's Russian green. This color is part of AK's Soviet green color modulation set. I really enjoy working with these AK colors because they have a good opacity. With just 2 or 3 layers I achieve a flawless coverage. The airbrush I am using is a Fengda FE 183K with a 0.5mm nozzle. The wheels get a quick spray as well. For the color modulation I will start with AK Extra Dark Green. This is then sprayed on all the parts that would cast shadows on the real tank, like under the turret or in the running gear. By using tape to mask certain parts, I can get sharper edges between the different plates. The lighter areas will be painted using Russian Green 4B0. This color is simply sprayed from above over the whole tank. The effect might not be as visible on camera as it is in person. The final highlights are made with AK Silver Grey, which is neither silver nor grey in my opinion, but green. The color is very light, so I can't or won't use an airbrush, but a regular fine brush instead. I am highlighting all the rivets and bolts. This may not look 100% realistic, but I personally like the effect it has. The same goes for other race details. Now I can start with the chipping. A piece of sponge with a small amount of light green is tapped over all the edges. This may look out of place now, but the effect will come in the next step. I can go quite heavy on the fuel tanks since they are already bent and damaged. I then combined a few of the smaller dots with a brush to create bigger patches. Things like the hatches would see a lot of movement, so you can go quite heavy on the chipping here. For step 2 I need a darker color. This time I am using AK's Track Primer. Now I fill all the bright spots to show the deeper chips that got down to the metal. To get a decent result with this technique, you need to have a fine brush. You only want to fill the inner part of each patch with the darker color and leave the outmost parts in the lighter tone. That way you can resemble the transition from undamaged paint to slightly chipped paint up to the underlying metal. Looking at reference pictures of rusty and damaged vehicles can give you a good inspiration on where damage on the paint job would occur. With the chipping finished, I can start painting the details. The towing cables got a base coat of gunmetal, and the backs and storage I did in part 1 are colored in different brown and khaki tones. I tried to prime the tracks with AK's track primer from earlier, but for some reason that color won't work with my airbrush and it keeps clogging. I'm not sure if I got a defective bottle or if that's common. I then had to switch to Vallejo's track primer, which worked just fine. I decided to make a T-34 from Berlin in 1945. These tanks have very distinctive white markings on their turrets. Since there are no decals for these, I painted them with a brush. By stippling the brush, I wanted to make it look like the white color was field applied by the troops. I had to hand paint the number on the turret as well, which was quite difficult, but I referenced the tank 230 for this. The rubber on the road wheels gets a coat of anthracite from Revell. The Russian tanks in Berlin 1945 were often seen with bat string armor attached to them. They were not included, so I had to build my own. For that I will be using this fine plastic mesh I had laying around. I start by cutting the mesh into rectangles using scissors. I used an in-scale figure to get a rough estimate on the size. I then used a thin styrene strip for the outer frame. These were then attached using superglue. I also attached a small metal wire to the bottom of each corner, but I forgot to press record. After priming them black, I used different orange and rust tones to color them. They were looking a little bit too bright for my taste, so I applied a darker rust wash on top of them. To prepare the model for the following steps, I had to protect all the work I have done so far with a clear coat of gloss varnish from Vallejo. The tracks received a heavy wash using mixed track wash. This will just be the base layer to create a few shadows and break up the still uniform surface. I made a simple wash using Abteilung 502 brown wash and white spirit. Here the gloss varnish I applied before helps the wash flow around and into all the small details and panel lines. I used the same wash for the accessories as well. The dark wash around the bolts combined with the bright highlights from earlier really make them pop. I don't worry too much about making a mess, because I can clean up everything later using some more white spirit, and everything that won't get cleaned adds to the dirt and grime effect. Because I imagine the tank to be in the city of Berlin, I will focus on dry mud and dirt effects. A nice base layer is AK's Diorama Dry Grounds Terrain. While originally meant for ground textures, it's perfect to add the needed amount of volume without spending half a bottle of enamel mud. Since this is water-based paste, I can use tap water to soften the edges and manipulate the mud. But I have to work in small sections because the paste dries quite fast and turns almost rock solid. I am focusing on the mud from the bottom up since that's where the dirt would accumulate. On the front and back, I use a wet brush to create a streaking effect. I can't forget the wheels. They also get a small amount of texture that is then thinned down with water to reach all the nooks and crannies. After letting everything dry for a day, I can get back to the enamel effects. I am using Ammo by Mick Dry Light Soil for this. This enamel mud is placed at random over the first mud layer. Instead of water, I have to use white spirit to blend it. This product works really well for creating a streaking effect. I just place a small amount on the top and use a damp brush to drag the mud down. The end product should dry completely matte and look like a thin layer of dust. Both the AK and the MIG mud are quite similar in color. To add a different color into the mix, I am using Ammo by Mick Turned Dirt. This is used very sparingly and focused mostly on the lower parts, where the mud might still be wetter than at the top. Here you can see what difference it makes to use enamel based effects. I have no difficulty creating a seamless blend between the two colors, despite the first color being applied 15 minutes ago. Let's take a closer look at the current progress and how the mud turned out after drying. I really enjoy how it looks so far, but there are still a few more things that need work. To create the bare metal on the contact points between the wheels and tracks, I used a soft pencil. I tried the same on the tracks, but I just started peeling off the paint from the rubber. The upper hull was way too clean, so I used the same mud effects from earlier to create some dirt accumulations in the corner. Make sure to always use the same color palette over the entire tank, like you would see on a real vehicle. Now I can attach the wheels to the running gear. A small dab of super glue on each axle and the wheels should stay in place. It's important to keep these parts clean from any mud effects, otherwise you will face problems when the wheels no longer fit. The sides are still a bit empty and clean. I made streaking effects with AK's rain effects. First I made a thin brush stroke from the top to the bottom. I let it dry for a few minutes and then take a brush dampened with some white spirit to drag the streaking marks down. I also wanted to add some fuel spills on the fuel tanks. I have covered the entire model in a layer of matte varnish, as you can see. This effect will stay shiny to make it look more natural, like real fuel or oil. You can also add a few stains around various hatches on the engine deck. And don't forget that the fuel spills would of course leave marks under the tanks as well. The bed string armor is then added with some super glue. These were quite fragile, but everything stayed where I wanted it to. Like on my Panther build, I wanted to add some self-made tarps. These are just tissue papers first soaked in a mixture made from PVA glue and water. Then different brown, khaki and green tones are blended into the wet glue mix. You should lift the wet tissue a few times during painting to avoid it sticking to the surface. I let it dry for around 5 minutes. I folded them a few times before adding them to the model. The paper creates realistic folds, just like a real tarp. This has quickly become one of my favorite details to add to my models. A brush with more PVA water mix helps to press the tarp down into all the corners. And in addition to looking good, these tarps will make adding figures easier. I painted these Soviet tank riders off camera. I still have to practice figure painting before I want to show it on camera. Still, they will make a nice addition to the tank. I just have to firmly press them into the wet tarp and it looks like he's actually sitting there. The whole process is then repeated for the remaining tarps. I even found this tank driver in my stash, so I can keep the hatch open. The interior has been painted white wherever I could reach. Now only a few splashes of mud are missing. For these I used Ammo by Mick turned dirt splashes. These are applied all around the tank and the running gear. I used white spirit for cleanup and blending. The last step is to add some black pigment for the exhausts, and it's time for the final result. And with that the tank is finished. I had a lot of fun and I am very happy with the end result. You have any feedback or suggestions? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe for more content. I would greatly appreciate that. Have a nice week and see you next time.